The thunder of hooves tore through the morning silence as Grace Calloway raced across the dusty plains, her wheat-colored hair whipping wildly behind her. Blood seeped through her tattered dress, but she dared not stop, not with the angry voices of Whispering Creek's townsfolk still ringing in her ears, their accusations chasing her like specters. Which, they had called her, unclean. They had proclaimed when all she'd done was attempt to save the mayor's son with herbs after the town doctor had given up. The boy had lived, but his fever dreams during recovery had spoken of angels and demons, and suddenly Grace was marked with suspicion that festered into outright hatred. The drought that followed sealed her fate. The crops withered, cattle sickened, and Grace became the scapegoat for a town desperate for answers. A mob had formed at dawn, torches in hand despite the morning light, and Grace had barely escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a wound where a stone had struck her side. Her mare, Belle, began to falter after hours of hard riding, the animal's breath coming in labored gasps. Grace pulled back on the reins reluctantly, scanning the horizon. The land stretched empty in all directions, save for a small homestead nestled against distant hills to the west. Desperation pushed her toward it. The year was 1876, and the untamed territories of the American West cared little for a woman alone. Grace knew her odds, but she would not surrender to fear. She had her knowledge, her hands that could heal, and her resolve. It would have to be enough. As she approached the modest cabin, the door swung open. A tall figure emerged, rifle in hand, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Grace's vision blurred, her strength finally giving way as she slid from Belle's saddle. The last thing she remembered was strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," said a deep voice, tinged with concern rather than threat. When Grace awoke, she found herself lying on a narrow bed inside a sparsely furnished but clean cabin. Her side had been bandaged, though clumsily. A man sat in a chair nearby, whittling a piece of wood with practiced hands. He looked up as she stirred. "You've been out since midday," he said, setting aside his work. "Figured you might be running from something, the way you came tearing across my land." Grace tried to sit up but winced at the pain in her side. "I wouldn't do that just yet," he cautioned, rising to his feet. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of worn leather. "Name's Garrett Lawson. This is my homestead." "Grace," she replied, her voice raspy with thirst. "Grace Calloway," Garrett nodded, fetching a cup of water from a bucket near the hearth. "What brings you out here in such a state, Miss Calloway?" Grace accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips. "The people of Whispering Creek, they named me Unclean, said I brought the drought with witchcraft." She gave a bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. Garrett's expression hardened. "Folks can turn cruel when they're scared. I've seen it before." He moved to a chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a faded quilt, carefully laying it over her. "Rest now. Heal before you answer anyone else's questions, including mine. Whatever's chasing you won't find you here tonight." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Grace's eyes. She had expected suspicion, perhaps even to be turned away. Instead, this stranger had offered sanctuary without demanding explanations. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Garrett replied with a hint of a smile. "I'm a terrible cook, and you'll be stuck with my company until you're well enough to move on." Grace felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, something that had nothing to do with her wound. "I can cook," she offered. "Once I'm on my feet. Then we have an arrangement," Garrett said, moving toward the door. "I'll see to your horse, you sleep." As he stepped outside, Grace allowed herself to relax slightly for the first time in days. She didn't know if she could trust this man, but for now, she had little choice. Tomorrow would bring decisions, but tonight, she would accept the gift of shelter and an unexpected ally. The next few days passed in a fragile routine. Grace's wound began to heal, though the gash was deeper than she had initially thought. Garrett proved to be a man of few words but consistent actions. He brought fresh water each morning, changed her bandage with careful if unpracticed hands, and respected her privacy by sleeping in the small lean-to attached to the cabin. On the fourth day, Grace insisted on getting up. "I cannot lie here forever," she said firmly when Garrett frowned at her attempt. And I promise to cook. A deal is a deal. Stubborn woman, Garrett muttered, but he helped her to the table nonetheless, his touch gentle as he guided her to a chair. Grace surveyed the humble kitchen area. What supplies do you have? Beans, salt pork, flour, coffee, some dried apples from last fall, he shrugged. I hunt when meat's needed. There's a vegetable patch out back, though it's suffering from the dry spell. Grace nodded thoughtfully. I can work with that. And perhaps I can help with your garden. I know ways to make plants thrive even when water is scarce. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. Is that what got you in trouble, knowing things others don't understand? That, and being a woman alone, Grace admitted quietly. After my father died last winter, there was no one to stand between me and their suspicions. Garrett was silent for a long moment. Well, Miss Calloway, I don't much care what you know or how you know it, so long as you can make something edible from those beans. I've been eating my own cooking far too long. That evening, Grace prepared a simple but flavorful stew, seasoned with wild herbs she instructed Garrett to gather from around the property. They ate in companionable silence until Garrett spoke. You never said where you were headed. Grace set down her spoon. I have no destination, I simply ran. You could stay, Garrett said, the words coming out gruff and awkward. Until you decide. This place needs a woman's touch and I could use the help, the garden like you mentioned. Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger? Grace asked, studying his face for signs of ulterior motives. A woman accused of witchcraft, no less. Garrett met her gaze steadily. Because I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. 3 years ago, I was accused of a crime I didn't commit. Had to leave everything behind and start fresh. This land, it gives second chances to those willing to work for them. Grace felt the weight of his words, the shared understanding of what it meant to be cast out. I would not want to bring trouble to your door. Whispering Creek is 2 days' ride from here, Garrett said with a shrug, and I don't make a habit of going to town more than necessary. Besides, he added with the ghost of a smile, this is the best meal I've had in years. That night, lying in Garrett's bed while he once again took the lean-to, Grace considered his offer. It wasn't only practical, it felt right in a way she couldn't explain. There was something about Garrett Lawson that put her at ease, despite the circumstances of their meeting. As the days turned into weeks, Grace found herself settling into life at the homestead. Her side healed completely, leaving only a thin scar to remember the stone's impact. True to her word, she revived Garrett's struggling garden with careful attention and knowledge of which plants could share space to conserve water. Garrett, for his part, worked from dawn until dusk on the endless tasks of maintaining the homestead. He was building a proper barn, he explained, to expand his small herd of cattle. Grace often watched him work, admiring the quiet determination with which he approached every task. They developed a routine that felt natural, as if they had been sharing this life for years rather than weeks. Grace took charge of the cabin, cooking and mending, while assisting with the livestock when needed. Garrett handled the heavier work, but began teaching Grace to shoot his old revolver, just in case. A woman alone needs to protect herself, he said matter-of-factly, adjusting her grip on the weapon. Am I alone? Grace asked before she could stop herself, her cheeks flushing at the implication of her words. Garrett's hands stilled on hers. No, he said softly, you're not. Something shifted between them that afternoon, a silent acknowledgement that what had begun as temporary arrangement was becoming something neither had expected. The first kiss happened during a sudden summer rainstorm. They had been racing to collect laundry from the line when the clouds opened above them. Laughing, drenched to the skin, they collided at the cabin door. Garrett's hands steadied her, and then, without planning or pretense, his lips found hers. It was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. When Grace responded, rising on her toes to meet him more fully, the kiss deepened into something that stole her breath and made her heart race faster than her flight from Whispering Creek. I didn't plan this, Garrett murmured when they finally parted. Nor did I, Grace replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, but I'm not sorry. That night, for the first time, Garrett didn't sleep in the lean-to. Instead, they shared the narrow bed, talking into the small hours about their pasts, their hopes, the lives they had left behind. Grace told him about her mother, who had taught her about healing plants before consumption took her away. Garrett spoke of the false accusation of cattle rustling that had forced him to flee his previous home in Kansas. "I've never told anyone the whole story," he confessed as dawn began to lighten the cabin. "Nor have I," Grace said, her head resting on his shoulder. "It feels right, though, to share it with you." The summer passed in a haze of hard work and newfound happiness. Grace's knowledge of plants yielded a garden bounty despite the continuing drought, and Garrett's cattle herd grew with the birth of several calves. They talked of expanding the cabin, adding another room now that it seemed clear Grace would stay. But their peace was shattered on a crisp autumn morning when the sound of approaching horses broke the quiet. Garrett was checking fence lines in the north pasture, leaving Grace alone at the cabin. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the sun to make out the 3 riders approaching. Her blood ran cold as she recognized Sheriff Davis from Whispering Creek, flanked by 2 men she didn't know. Fear rooted her to the spot as they drew closer, stopping several yards from the cabin. "Well, if it ain't the witch herself," Sheriff Davis called out, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "Thought you could just disappear, did you?" Grace raised her chin, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have no quarrel with Whispering Creek. I've made a new life here." "That's so." Davis sneered. "Bewitched yourself another man, looks like. Town council wants you brought back for proper questioning about the sickness that took 4 children after you fled." "I had nothing to do with any sickness," Grace protested, her hands clenching at her sides. "I tried to help your people." "Save your lies for the judge," Davis said, dismounting. "You're coming with us, willing or not." The 2 other men followed his lead, advancing toward the porch. Grace backed toward the door, frantically calculating whether she could reach Garrett's rifle inside before they reached her. The crack of a gunshot froze everyone in place. Garrett appeared at the edge of the property, rifle raised, his horse blowing hard from a fast ride. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is private property and you're not welcome here." Sheriff Davis turned slowly. "This matter doesn't concern you, mister. We've come for the woman. She's wanted for questioning in Whispering Creek. Grace Calloway is under my protection," Garrett stated firmly, urging his horse forward until he was positioned between the men and the cabin. "Whatever accusations you have are baseless. She's harmed no one." "Protection?" Davis scoffed. "You mean bewitchment. She's clouded your mind same as she did to others." Garrett's expression darkened. "I suggest you leave now while you still can. There's nothing for you here." The tension crackled in the air as the 2 men faced off. Davis's companions shifted uneasily, clearly not having expected armed resistance. "You're making a mistake," Davis warned. "Harboring a witch won't end well for you." "The only mistake would be if you don't turn around and ride out in the next minute," Garrett replied evenly, though Grace could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. "I don't want bloodshed on my land, but I will protect what's mine." The words sent a wave of warmth through Grace despite the danger. She belonged somewhere to someone again. After a tense standoff, Davis jerked his head toward his horse. "This isn't over," he spat. "The drought's spreading. People are desperate for answers. They'll come in greater numbers next time." "And I'll be waiting," Garrett promised, keeping his rifle trained on them as they mounted up and rode away. When they were out of sight, Garrett dismounted and strode to the porch, gathering Grace into his arms. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "No," Grace assured him, though she couldn't stop trembling. "But they'll be back. Garrett, I can't stay here. I'm putting you in danger." Garrett took her face between his hands. "Listen to me, Grace. I meant what I said. You're mine to protect and I'm yours. We're in this together now." His eyes searched hers. Unless you don't want to be." "I do," Grace whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "More than anything, but I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." Garrett brushed away her tears with his thumbs. "Nothing will happen to either of us." "But we need to be prepared." That night they laid plans. The homestead was defensible, but if a larger group came from town, they would be outnumbered. They needed allies and evidence to disprove the accusations against Grace. "There's a trading post about half a day's ride east," Garrett said as they sat at the table, a map spread before them. "Run by a man named Henry Jenkins. He has connections with the territorial judge and doesn't much care for Sheriff Davis." If we can get word to him about what's happening, he might be able to help. And what of the sickness in Whispering Creek? Grace asked, troubled. If children are truly dying. Garrett covered her hand with his. It's not your doing. The drought has driven people to desperate measures. They're probably drinking from contaminated water sources. Grace's eyes widened. The south well. Just before I left, I noticed an odd smell. I warned Mayor Collins, but he dismissed me. She gripped Garrett's hand tightly. If that's the source, I can prove it wasn't witchcraft but natural causes making people ill. It's dangerous to go back there, Garrett cautioned. More dangerous to wait for them to come to us in force, Grace countered. If we can gather evidence and present it to the territorial judge first. Garrett was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between protecting Grace and acknowledging the logic of her plan. Finally, he nodded. We'll ride to the trading post tomorrow, together, then we'll decide our next move. The journey to Jenkins' trading post took longer than expected. A washed-out bridge forced them to detour, adding hours to their trip. When they finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the collection of buildings that served as a hub for travelers and nearby homesteaders. Henry Jenkins proved to be exactly as Garrett had described, a shrewd businessman with little patience for foolishness and a strong sense of justice. After hearing their story in the privacy of his office behind the store, he stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. Davis has been sheriff too long without proper oversight, he said, and this drought has everyone looking for someone to blame. He fixed Grace with a penetrating gaze. You truly believe the south well is contaminated? I'm certain of it, Grace affirmed. The water had a sulfurous odor and a faint yellow tinge. Animals were avoiding it, but people kept drinking because it was the most convenient source in that part of town. Jenkins nodded slowly. Judge Parker is due through here in 2 weeks on his circuit. If you can gather proof before then, he's a fair man who'll listen. 2 weeks might be too late, Garrett pointed out. Sheriff Davis won't wait that long to return with more men. Then I suggest you work quickly, Jenkins replied. I can send word to some neighboring homesteads. Most of them have had run-ins with Davis and would be willing to stand with you if it comes to trouble. As they prepared to leave, Jenkins pulled Garrett aside. Grace couldn't hear their exchange, but when Garrett rejoined her, his expression was grim. What did he say? She asked once they were mounted and heading back. There have been more deaths in Whispering Creek, Garrett replied heavily, and rumors that a hunting party is forming to track you down. Grace's stomach clenched with fear but also determination. Then we need to find proof quickly. We should go to Whispering Creek directly? Absolutely not, Garrett objected. It's too dangerous. We don't have time to wait for Judge Parker, Grace insisted. Every day more people could be sickening from that water. And if we're seen approaching the town together, they'll assume you're under my spell and shoot first. Garrett reined his horse to a stop, forcing Grace to do the same. What are you suggesting? I go alone, Grace said, meeting his gaze steadily. As a healer, I know what to look for. I can gather a sample from the well, observe the patterns of illness. If I'm careful, I can be in and out before anyone realizes. And if you're caught, Garrett demanded, his voice rough with fear. I won't be, Grace promised, reaching across to touch his arm. I'll go at night. There's a widow who lives at the edge of town, Martha Simmons. She was kind to me, even when others turned away. I can trust her to shelter me for one night. They argued throughout the ride home, but in the end, Garrett reluctantly conceded that Grace's plan offered the best chance of gathering evidence quickly. Still, he insisted on modifications. I'll come with you, but stay hidden in the woods outside town, he said as they prepared for bed that night. If you're not back by dawn, I'm coming in after you, Grace agreed, knowing she couldn't dissuade him from that much protection. We'll leave tomorrow evening, she said. We can reach Whispering Creek by midnight. The following night found them approaching the town from the south, using the cover of darkness and the tree line that ran near the outskirts. Grace had changed into her plainest dress with a shawl to cover her distinctive hair. In her satchel, she carried small glass vials for water samples and a notebook to record her observations. They stopped in a dense copse of trees within sight of the first scattered houses. Remember, Garrett said, helping her down from her horse. Martha Simmons first, then the well. Be back here before first light. He reached into his coat and pressed something into her hand, his revolver. Just in case. Grace tucked the weapon into her pocket, then stood on tiptoe to kiss him fiercely. I will come back to you, she whispered against his lips. You better, Garrett replied, his voice rough with emotion. I've only just found you. With a final squeeze of his hand, Grace slipped away into the darkness, making her way carefully toward the edge of town. Martha Simmons' small house stood apart from its neighbors, with a kitchen garden out back that had once benefited from Grace's advice. Grace approached cautiously, checking for signs of movement inside. A single candle burned in the window, Martha's habit when she couldn't sleep. Taking it as a good omen, Grace tapped lightly on the back door. Long moments passed before the door creaked open a crack, revealing Martha's wizened face. The old woman's eyes widened in shock. Grace Calloway, she hissed. Child, have you lost your mind coming back here? Please, Martha, Grace whispered. I need your help. May I come in? Just for a moment, Martha hesitated, then opened the door wider. Quickly, before someone sees. Once inside the humble kitchen, Grace explained her purpose as concisely as possible. Martha listened with increasing concern. The well, you say? She murmured when Grace had finished. Come to think of it, those who have sickened worst all live nearest the South Square, and my late husband always said that well was dug too close to the old tannery grounds. The tannery, Grace exclaimed softly. Of course the chemicals they used could have seeped into the groundwater over time. Martha nodded grimly. Sheriff's been too busy organizing search parties for you to listen to reason. 4 more children have died this past week alone. Guilt stabbed through Grace, though she knew the deaths weren't her fault. I need to examine that well tonight and take samples. Then I can bring evidence to the territorial judge. It's watched, Martha warned. Mayor posted a guard after the last death, though it's more to keep people from talking than to actually solve anything. Grace considered this complication. Is it Tommy Watson on guard? The deputy? Martha nodded. Most nights. He drinks, though, especially on cooler nights like tonight. A plan formed in Grace's mind. I need a sleeping draft, something I can slip to him that won't harm him but will ensure he stays asleep for a few hours. Martha's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. I might have just the thing. Your teachings didn't fall on deaf ears, you know. She hobbled to a cupboard and removed a small bottle. Valerian and hops steeped strong, works on my arthritis pains at night. Perfect, Grace said gratefully. Now I need a way to approach without being seen. Martha thought for a moment, then shuffled to another cupboard. My George's old clothes, she said, pulling out trousers, a shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. You're tall for a woman. In the dark, with your hair tucked up, you could pass for a young man long enough to get close. Grace changed quickly, binding her hair under the hat. Martha helped her adjust the clothing, then stepped back to assess the disguise. It'll do, she decided. Now, for getting to the well without being seen. The old woman moved to a chest and withdrew a battered flask. Tommy Watson has a weakness for whiskey. Offer him a drink on a cold night, and he won't look too closely at who's offering. Armed with the flask containing Martha's sleeping draft, mixed with a small amount of actual whiskey, Grace slipped back into the night. The south well stood in a small square surrounded by shuttered businesses. As Martha had predicted, Deputy Tommy Watson sat on a stool beside it, rifle across his knees, looking bored and cold. Grace approached from the shadows, walking with the slight swagger she'd observed in young men. Evening, she called softly in a deliberately deepened voice. Mighty cold for guard duty. Tommy straightened, peering into the darkness. Who's there? Just passing through, Grace replied, stepping closer but keeping her hat brim low. Saw you sitting here all alone and thought you might appreciate a warming drink. She held up the flask, letting it catch the moonlight. Tommy's suspicion visibly warred with his desire for the whiskey. Mighty neighborly, he said finally. Don't mind if I do. Grace handed him the flask, careful to keep her movements masculine and her face shadowed. Heard there's been trouble in town. Sickness? Tommy took a long swallow, grimacing slightly at the taste but drinking again nonetheless. Bad business, 4 little ones dead, others ailing. Mayor says it's that witch Calloway's doing, but if you ask me, he took another pull from the flask, don't make sense. She was always helping folks before. That's so, Grace encouraged, watching as Tommy's eyelids grew heavier. Always thought she was a fine woman. Pretty too. Tommy's words began to slur. Don't tell anyone I said that. They'd run me out of town too. Your secret's safe, Grace assured him as he slumped further on his stool. Within minutes, Tommy was snoring softly, the rifle loose in his grasp. Working quickly, Grace removed several vials from her satchel. She lowered a small bucket into the well and collected water samples, noting the faint yellowish tinge even in the moonlight. The sulfurous smell was stronger than she remembered. How had no one else connected this to the illnesses? She corked the vials carefully and tucked them away, then used a piece of charcoal from her satchel to mark a large X on the wellhead, a warning that she hoped some would heed. As a final measure, she penned a quick note on a page from her notebook. Well poisoned by tannery waste, not witchcraft, and secured it to the wellhead with a length of twine. It was a risk, revealing her presence this way, but she couldn't leave without trying to prevent more deaths. She positioned Tommy more comfortably against the well's stone wall, placing the now empty flask beside him to support the appearance that he had simply drunk himself to sleep. Grace had just turned to leave when a voice froze her in her tracks. I thought you might come back. Sheriff Davis stepped from the shadows of a nearby building, his revolver drawn and pointed at her chest. Didn't expect the disguise, though. Clever. Grace's hand inched toward her pocket where Garrett's revolver waited, but Davis shook his head. I wouldn't, he warned. I've got 3 men positioned around this square. You're surrounded, Grace raised her hands slowly. I'm not a witch, Sheriff. I'm a healer who understands science. Your well is contaminated with chemicals from the old tannery grounds. That's what's killing your children, not my curses. Davis's expression flickered with uncertainty before hardening again. More lies. You've brought nothing but trouble to this town. I've brought the truth, Grace countered, desperately playing for time. Test the water yourself. Send it to a chemist in the city if you don't believe me. Enough talk, Davis growled. You're coming with me to face justice for what you've done. A new voice cut through the night. She's not going anywhere with you. Garrett stepped into the square, his rifle trained on the sheriff. Grace's heart leapt to her throat. He was supposed to wait in the woods. You're outnumbered, stranger, Davis said without taking his eyes off Grace. My men will cut you down where you stand. I think not, came another voice, and Grace turned to see Henry Jenkins emerge from an alleyway, shotgun in hand. Behind him were 4 other men, all armed and grim-faced. We've already dealt with your men, Davis. They're tied up nice and neat at the jailhouse. Davis's face contorted with rage. This doesn't concern you, Jenkins. When you start accusing innocent women of witchcraft to cover up your town's negligence, it concerns every decent person in the territory, Jenkins replied evenly. Now put down your gun before someone gets hurt. For a moment, it seemed Davis might shoot anyway. His finger tightened on the trigger as his eyes darted between Grace and the newcomers. Then, with a curse, he lowered his weapon. You've made a powerful enemy today, Jenkins, he snarled. Not as powerful as the territorial judge will be when he sees evidence of how you've handled this situation, Jenkins replied, nodding to one of his men to take Davis's gun. Speaking of evidence, Miss Calloway, did you find what you were looking for? Grace nodded, patting her satchel. Water samples and observations. The well is clearly contaminated with tannery chemicals. I've marked it as unsafe. Good, Jenkins said with satisfaction. Judge Parker arrived at my trading post just after you left. Seems he decided to move up his circuit after hearing rumors of witchcraft accusations. He's waiting for us there now. Relief flooded through Grace as Garrett moved to her side, his arm going around her protectively. It's over, he murmured. You're safe now. Not quite over, Grace corrected, looking toward the well. These people still need clean water and treatment for those who are sick. 3 days later, Whispering Creek was a changed town. Judge Parker, having reviewed Grace's evidence and heard testimony from Martha Simmons and others, had removed Sheriff Davis from office pending a formal investigation. The South Well had been permanently sealed after tests confirmed Grace's diagnosis of chemical contamination. Most importantly, Grace had been officially cleared of all accusations. Under the judge's protection, she had returned to town to treat the sick children, showing the townspeople how to use activated charcoal and certain herbs to draw poisons from the body. Already, the remaining ill children were showing signs of improvement. "You could stay, you know," Mayor Collins said awkwardly as Grace packed her medical supplies after checking on the last patient. His earlier hostility had given way to shamefaced gratitude after his own daughter began to recover under Grace's care. "The town needs a healer with your knowledge." Grace shook her head, glancing out the window where Garrett waited patiently with their horses. "Thank you, Mayor, but I have a home elsewhere now." "With that rancher?" the mayor asked, following her gaze. "Yes," Grace replied simply. "We're building a life together." Mayor Collins nodded slowly. "He's a lucky man. We were fools to drive you away, Miss Calloway." "Fear makes fools of us all sometimes," Grace said without rancor, "but I hope the town has learned from this. Knowledge isn't witchcraft, and a woman alone isn't automatically a threat. We've learned," the mayor assured her, "and we won't forget." Outside, Garrett straightened as Grace emerged from the house. The autumn sunlight caught in his hair, turning it to burnished gold, and his smile warmed her more than any fire could. "Ready to go home?" he asked as she approached. Grace took his offered hand, savoring the word, home. Not just a place, but a person. This man who had taken in a wounded stranger, tucked a quilt around her, and told her to heal before answering anyone's questions or demands. "More than ready," she replied, mounting her horse. As they rode out of Whispering Creek side by side, Grace felt the weight of the past finally lifting. Ahead lay the homestead that would soon be their home in truth. Garrett had proposed the night after the confrontation at the well, offering a simple ring that had belonged to his mother. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at Jenkins' trading post, with Judge Parker officiating and Martha Simmons in attendance as Grace's witness. The old woman had decided to sell her house in Whispering Creek and move closer to the trading post where she had relatives. Winter came early that year but found the Lawson homestead well prepared. The cabin had been expanded with a new bedroom and a larger kitchen. Grace's garden, harvested and preserved, would see them through until spring. Garrett's cattle, healthy and fat, grazed contentedly in the lower pastures. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside, Garrett and Grace sat before the hearth, wrapped in the same quilt he had covered her with on that first day, now mended and cherished as a symbol of their beginning. "I have something for you," Garrett said, reaching behind the chair to produce a small wooden box. "I've been working on it in secret." Grace opened it carefully to find a beautifully carved set of small drawers and compartments, each labeled with the name of a different herb or remedy. "For your medicines," Garrett explained, "so you can keep helping people on your terms." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she traced the intricate work with her fingertips. "It's beautiful, thank you." Garrett drew her closer, one hand coming to rest protectively over her stomach, where their first child had just begun to grow, news she had shared with him only that morning. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for running in my direction that day." Grace turned in his arms, framing his beloved face between her hands. "I think I was always running toward you, I just didn't know it." Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their future, a future neither could have imagined when a wounded woman fled across the plains, and a solitary rancher decided to offer shelter rather than suspicion. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the land in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and two people who had once been alone discovered that home wasn't a place at all, but the peace found in each other's arms. Spring brought new life to the Lawson homestead. The drought finally broke with gentle, soaking rains that turned the pastures emerald green and filled the creek beds to overflowing. Grace's garden flourished under her careful tending, with new medicinal herbs taking their place alongside vegetables for their table. Most precious of all was the arrival of their daughter, Elizabeth, born as the first wildflowers opened across the plains. She had her father's steady gaze and her mother's determined chin, stubborn from both sides, as Garrett fondly remarked when she refused to sleep through the night. Word of Grace's healing abilities spread gradually through the surrounding homesteads. Folks began to come with ailments and injuries, always treated with the same care regardless of where they hailed from. Even a few brave souls from Whispering Creek made the journey, returning with tales of the kind healer and her devoted husband. "Never thought I'd be married to the most famous woman in the territory," Garrett teased one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Elizabeth slept peacefully in a cradle beside them, her tiny fist curled around her mother's finger. "Infamous, perhaps," Grace corrected with a smile, "though the witch stories seem to be fading." "Good," Garrett said firmly, "though I wouldn't mind if a few remained. Keeps troublemakers at a distance." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment warming her more than the lingering heat of the day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't ridden onto your land that day?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "No," he said finally. "Because I can't imagine any life but this one now." "Nor can I," Grace agreed softly. As stars began to appear in the deepening twilight, they remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of their land and the gentle breathing of their child. The town had named her Unclean, but here she had found a place to be whole not despite her knowledge and strength, but because of it. In Garrett's eyes, she had never been unclean or unworthy. He had seen her value from the first moment, offering safety and respect when she most needed them. That gift had grown into love, and love into the family they now cherished. The past could not be forgotten, but it no longer defined her. Grace Calloway Lawson was a healer, a wife, a mother, and above all, a woman who had found her rightful place in a world that had once sought to cast her out. As for Garrett, the solitary rancher had discovered that the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from standing beside the woman who had brought light and purpose to his life. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, a home where healing, understanding, and love flourished like Grace's garden after the rain. And as they carried their sleeping daughter inside, closing the door against the night, they knew with quiet certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced all others side by side, stronger together than apart. In the years that followed, the legend of the healer and her rancher husband became part of the territory's folklore. Some told it as a ghost story, others as a romance, but those who knew the truth understood it was simply the story of two people brave enough to trust when the world gave them every reason not to. And in that courage, they had found not just survival, but a life worth living one day, one season, 1 year at a time, beneath the vast western sky that had witnessed both their trials and their triumphs.